The moment I stepped off the shuttle onto the alien platform, I could already tell this was going to be one of those missions where nothing goes according to plan. The trade briefing had been straightforward: negotiate the resource exchange, gather intel on their market demands, maintain diplomatic decorum. Simple enough. And yet, the moment I laid eyes on the ambassador, I realized none of that mattered anymore. Not a single word of the mission brief had prepared me for the effect her presence, or more accurately, her physics-defying anatomy, would have on the room. She moved with a casual grace that suggested she owned every centimeter of space, yet the air around her seemed to rebel against gravity itself. Every step she took made nearby devices vibrate, floating pens wobble mid-air, and holographic screens flicker. I caught a small communication tablet mid-fall, only to have a projector hover inches from my face before bouncing gently against a wall. She didn't even notice, glancing at me with an amused tilt of her head. The way she laughed, soft and melodic, made everything around her feel like it had its own rhythm, a rhythm that my poor, human brain was failing miserably to keep up with. I tried to straighten my uniform and remind myself that professionalism came first. My voice, calm in theory, faltered when I introduced myself. "I am your public relations liaison for this mission," I stammered, glancing at the console that had begun orbiting lazily around my feet. She inclined her head, eyes glinting with curiosity and something else, playfulness, maybe mischief. "Ah," she said, her tone musical and oddly soothing. "So you are the one in charge of managing chaos, yes?" I swallowed hard. Managing chaos had never been in my training manual. Not for situations like this. I had no idea whether she was complimenting me or mocking me, but before I could process it, a floating notepad collided with my shoulder, sending a pen spinning across the room like a comet. I lunged for it, only to have a holographic projection flash in front of me, casting a graph across my uniform. I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding a stack of levitating files, and cursed under my breath. She merely chuckled, as if my clumsiness were part of the entertainment she had anticipated. Trying to focus, I pulled up the mission tablet, intending to review the trade data, but each time I typed, a small device nearby would drift too close, nudged along by the gravitational distortions her presence seemed to cause. I adjusted my stance, imagining a professional diplomat who never wavered under pressure. Then a pen rolled past my foot and sent a tiny drone spinning into the air. I watched helplessly as it tapped a floating control panel, causing a low hum to ripple through the room, followed by a series of warning lights. She tilted her head, observing me with an expression that could have been amusement or admiration, I couldn't tell which. I attempted to speak again, to assert some authority over the situation, but each time I opened my mouth, something, her inadvertent movements, the floating objects, the erratic hum of machinery, interrupted me. I found myself apologizing more to the equipment than to her. "Sorry, systems. Thank you for cooperating." She laughed, the sound echoing around the chamber, and somehow amplifying the floating chaos. I tried to note the humor for future reference. Humans should never underestimate the power of alien charm. The more I tried to remain professional, the more absurd the situation became. A ceremonial orb hovered inches from my face, spinning lazily as if taunting me, and I ducked just in time to avoid a collision that would surely have resulted in sparks. She stepped forward, completely unaware of the near disasters her very presence incited. I noticed small objects starting to orbit around her like miniature satellites, drinking cups, data pads, even a tiny security drone. I attempted to corral them with my hands, but each movement only seemed to add to the chaos, making the room feel like a ballet I had neither the rhythm nor the training to join. And yet, amid all the absurdity, there was something undeniable about her presence. Beyond the slapstick disasters and floating hardware, I found myself drawn to her intelligence, her confidence, the effortless way she commanded attention without demanding it. I was supposed to focus on the mission, on the trade agreements, the market analyses, the diplomatic protocol, but instead, I was noticing the way her laughter made everything feel lighter, the glimmer of amusement in her eyes when I flailed helplessly to prevent another near catastrophe. I could feel the words of the mission brief burning in my pocket, completely irrelevant. My priority had already shifted. By the time I managed to stabilize one of the orbiting devices with a tethered cable, I realized the mission was not going to be about spreadsheets or negotiations. It was about surviving her presence, navigating the chaos she unknowingly created, and, if I was being honest, figuring out how to keep from tripping over my own feet while trying to get a word in edgewise. I had to remind myself constantly, I was a professional. I had a duty. And yet, as she leaned slightly forward to inspect a floating console, smiling in that infuriatingly charming way, I knew that none of my training had prepared me for this. Everything in the room seemed to conspire against me: floating cups, wobbling screens, orbiting pens, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I caught her gaze again, and for a moment, the chaos faded into background noise. She raised an eyebrow, clearly noticing the way my attention had shifted, and I had no choice but to smile sheepishly. My hands were full of floating devices, my uniform dusted with holographic fragments, and yet I felt an unexpected thrill. The mission was no longer just about trade or diplomacy. Somehow, against all logic, she had become my priority. The meeting room was supposed to be a bastion of order, a place where diplomatic discussions could proceed without interruption. Instead, it felt more like a zero-gravity circus. I set up the holographic displays, aligned the data pads, and triple-checked the recording devices, hoping to salvage a shred of professionalism. Then she entered, casually stepping into the room as if gravity and decorum were optional suggestions. The moment she did, the air seemed to vibrate with her presence. Pens lifted off tables like confused birds, a projector flickered erratically, and a tiny communications drone spun in a lazy orbit around her head. I swallowed hard, trying to regain control. "Ladies and, esteemed representatives," I began. "Welcome to the preliminary trade discussions." My voice cracked slightly under the strain of dodging a floating cup that ricocheted off a console. She tilted her head, eyes gleaming with amusement, and I swear I saw a tiny smirk tug at the corner of her mouth. "You are nervous," she said, her voice like liquid music. "Or are you excited?" I froze. My inner monologue argued with itself: professionalism first. Diplomacy first. Do not mention your excitement. Yet, as another floating notepad grazed my shoulder and a stack of files tumbled in slow motion toward the ceiling, I realized I could no longer separate the two. Excited was the only word that came close. I tried to continue with the presentation, pointing at a floating holographic chart. But before I could finish, her movement caused the projector to wobble violently. The chart spun into an abstract blur of color, a kaleidoscope of data that made no sense at all. I reached out to stabilize it, my hand colliding with one of her floating appendages. Well, more accurately, something that defied physics entirely. She giggled, tilting her head in the kind of way that made my pulse quicken while simultaneously making every device in the room behave like a hyperactive puppy. Diplomacy became a juggling act. Every time I tried to speak, a small gadget floated into my line of sight, threatening to knock over the hover table or knock a drink into my lap. I moved quickly to intercept a hovering pen, only to have a holographic keyboard spring into the air and land neatly on my shoulder. She looked utterly unconcerned, smiling as if she were conducting a private amusement show, and I had to remind myself constantly that this was serious business, with interstellar trade and human reputation on the line. I attempted to take notes on a tablet, but each time I touched it, a tiny floating drone bumped it, sending my carefully typed words into digital chaos. I sighed and muttered under my breath, "I have no idea how to survive this meeting." She laughed again, the sound carrying through the room, bouncing off walls and amplifying every chaotic movement. My eyes caught hers for a fleeting second, and she winked. Oh no, she winked, making me flinch violently and almost drop the tablet entirely. Trying to assert control, I demonstrated a gesture to stabilize the holographic charts, waving my hands over magnetic tethers I had hastily attached to the devices. For a moment it worked, lines straightened, charts aligned, but then she leaned forward, reaching for a floating orb of data, and the whole display collapsed in a spectacular cascade of spinning colors. The room went silent for half a second, except for my ragged breathing, and then she laughed again. Not maliciously, just amused. I had no defense against that. I realized, slowly, that the ambassador's obliviousness was not just a personal challenge, it was a professional one. Every bounce, step, and tilt she made had a ripple effect, knocking over delicate equipment, sending floating files spiraling, and turning a simple meeting into slapstick theater. I scrambled, catching one device here, nudging a hologram there, desperately trying to maintain decorum while my brain plotted dozens of contingency plans that would inevitably fail. And yet, amid the chaos, a strange sort of rhythm emerged. I found myself anticipating the arcs of floating pens, the likely trajectories of orbiting cups, and even her mischievous glances. My professional instincts merged with something more personal. Every laugh, every glance, every near miss sent a thrill through me I couldn't ignore. It was frustrating. It was impossible. And I realized that somewhere between the levitating drones and collapsing holograms, I was completely captivated. By the end of what should have been a short session, the room was a mess, charts misaligned, devices orbiting haphazardly, and my hair standing on end from static electricity. Yet the ambassador clapped her hands together in delight, seemingly oblivious to the disaster. "You are fascinating," she said, eyes sparkling, voice filled with playful sincerity. "You manage, well, somehow." I collapsed into my chair, catching a floating drink mid-air before it hit my lap. "Somehow," I muttered, barely able to breathe. "That is the most accurate word I've heard all day." I glanced at her, trying to regain some composure, but she smiled, and all professional barriers melted away. My focus had shifted entirely. No longer were spreadsheets, trade agreements, or diplomatic protocol my priority. She had become the center of my attention, and I had no choice but to admit it, even if it meant embracing the chaos she created. The following morning, I arrived at the meeting chamber armed with extra tethers, reinforced data pads, and a level of determination I hoped would withstand her presence. I thought I was prepared for diplomacy, for trade negotiations, for minor interruptions. I was not prepared for the full force of her. The moment she stepped through the doorway, the air seemed to warp around her once more. Pens hovered like satellites, floating cups pirouetted in midair, and one of the small communication drones spun rapidly, wobbling as if dizzy. I took a deep breath and tried to focus, reminding myself that human ingenuity had overcome far worse disasters than this. I positioned the holographic projectors, engaged the magnetic stabilizers, and secured every floating device I could find. Then she moved. Her casual steps sent a tiny graviton sensor flying into the air, where it ricocheted off a hovering data tablet and collided with a stack of papers, scattering them like confetti. I lunged to catch the papers, only to knock a small hovering drink into my shoulder. My uniform soaked, I froze, cursing my luck and wishing gravity were more consistent. She merely laughed, tilting her head in that mischievous, infuriatingly charming way. Attempting to regain control, I gestured toward the holographic charts, waving my hands to activate the stabilizers. The charts steadied for a moment, only for her to lean slightly forward and inspect a floating console. Immediately, a tablet launched into the air, spinning lazily before landing squarely in my lap. I cursed under my breath, glancing at her for a hint of sympathy. None came. Only amusement, the kind that made me feel both mortified and oddly exhilarated. I realized the meeting had turned into a performance, a test of human adaptability in the face of physics-defying chaos. I scrambled to catch floating devices, redirect hovering cups, and prevent holograms from colliding midair. Every movement was a dance, every step a calculation of trajectories. It was exhausting, frustrating, and unexpectedly thrilling. Amid the chaos, she observed me with an expression that suggested she was enjoying the spectacle, perhaps even rooting for me to fail just enough to make things more interesting. And yet, through the absurdity, a strange bond was forming. I noticed the way her eyes followed my frantic attempts to maintain order, how her laughter resonated with my own nervous chuckles. A flicker of something deeper passed between us, not just amusement, but recognition. I was impressed by her oblivious charm and intelligence, and she seemed intrigued by my relentless attempts to control the uncontrollable. Each time an object collided with me, I caught a glimpse of her smile and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the room's rising temperature. Then came the incident. A ceremonial orb, part of the planet's diplomatic tradition, hovered near the ceiling, glowing softly. I was in mid-lunge to catch a spinning data tablet when her casual movement sent the orb into a slow arc toward the wall. I flailed, stretching my arms, colliding with a floating keyboard, and somehow managed to intercept it just before it shattered. I collapsed onto a low platform, panting, drenched, and covered in holographic dust. She clapped her hands together, delighted. "You are remarkable," she said, eyes sparkling. "You handle chaos so admirably." I could only manage a weak smile, realizing she wasn't just observing me, she was testing me, engaging me. Each near disaster had become a shared experience, a form of playful communication. The room was a disaster zone, devices floating erratically, charts in disarray, papers orbiting like snowflakes, but between us, a subtle understanding had formed. She was fascinated by my perseverance, and I was captivated by her oblivious charm and infectious laughter. I attempted to speak, to regain some semblance of professionalism. We should probably focus on the trade data," I started, only to have a floating cup spin into my face. I ducked, nearly losing my balance, and she giggled, moving closer in zero gravity with the grace of someone entirely unconcerned with physics. I caught her glance, and my heart lurched. Somehow, in the midst of utter chaos, I was aware of every curve, every gesture, every mischievous spark in her eyes. My attempts to stabilize the room became increasingly creative. I grabbed magnetic tethers, improvised floating barriers, and even tried to redirect orbiting devices with careful nudges. Some worked. Most did not. Holographic charts flickered and spun, drones bumped into each other, and a small stack of ceremonial scrolls drifted past my face like leaves in a storm. Yet through it all we laughed together, her laughter melodic, mine embarrassed and unrefined. Every mishap became a bonding moment, every near disaster a shared secret of ridiculousness. By the end of the session, the room looked like a battlefield of floating debris, but the atmosphere between us had shifted. Professional barriers had dissolved amid laughter and shared chaos. I realized, with no small amount of disbelief, that I was no longer trying to survive her presence. I was trying to engage, to connect, to see what happened when human ingenuity met alien charm in full force. Somehow, amid levitating devices and collapsing holograms, I had found a rhythm with her. She had become both my greatest challenge and my most captivating distraction, and I could not imagine completing the mission, or wanting to, without her in the picture. By the final session, I had resigned myself to the truth. No amount of preparation could prevent her from turning a simple trade negotiation into a spectacle of chaos and absurdity. The chamber was already a familiar mess, floating devices, orbiting cups, scattered papers, but I approached it with cautious optimism. If there was a way to survive this, I would find it. And maybe, just maybe, I could salvage the mission and my dignity at the same time. She arrived with her usual grace, oblivious to the havoc she would unleash. I steadied a floating tablet with magnetic tethers and gave a resigned sigh. "Ready when you are," I muttered, bracing for impact. As soon as she moved forward, pens spun, holograms flickered, and a tiny drone bounced against my shoulder. I caught it mid-air, only for another to orbit dangerously close to my face. She smiled innocently, clearly unaware of the near disasters she caused, and I realized I was no longer annoyed. I was fascinated. I launched into the final presentation, my hands a blur as I stabilized charts, redirected devices, and kept a precarious balance on a low platform. Her presence made the charts wobble, the drones collide, and the floating cups spiral unpredictably, yet somehow, through sheer human ingenuity and a healthy dose of desperation, the information remained intact long enough to be recorded. I was inventing new methods of controlling zero-gravity chaos on the fly, my creativity fueled by equal parts fear and fascination. She watched, intrigued, her laughter punctuating my frantic movements. And then it happened. A ceremonial orb, larger than the others, floated toward the edge of the room, glowing softly and spinning slowly. I reached for it, stretching as far as I could, when she stepped closer, her movement accidentally nudging the orb into a new trajectory. I lunged, collided with a floating data pad, and somehow managed to grab it mid-flight, holding it triumphantly. She clapped her hands together, clearly delighted, and I realized something remarkable. I had survived. Not only survived, but I had mastered, in my own chaotic way, the unpredictable forces she brought into the room. We both laughed, our laughter mingling amid the orbiting chaos. She floated closer, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. The mission, the negotiations, the floating devices, all of it faded into background noise. I was aware only of her, the subtle sparkle in her eyes, and the mischievous tilt of her head. Her presence had been a challenge, a test, and now, unexpectedly, a connection. The absurdity of the situation had become a bridge, a shared experience that transcended protocol and procedure. I tried to speak, to regain some professional composure, but the words stumbled out in a mix of awe and relief. We did it. Everything is recorded, all data secured. Somehow we survived the, environment. She tilted her head, expression curious and amused, and I realized she was interpreting my awkward phrasing as both admiration and flirtation. I flushed, knowing that my attempts at professionalism had been entirely compromised by fascination, and probably desire. Floating devices hovered around us like an audience, yet we barely noticed. Her laughter rang out again, melodic and playful, and I found myself smiling despite the exhaustion. Somehow, through the chaos, we had created order, or at least a functional approximation of it. She floated closer, her gaze meeting mine, and in that moment, it wasn't about trade agreements, protocols, or mission success. It was about connection, shared absurdity, and the realization that amidst chaos, something unexpected and wonderful could emerge. I reached for one of the orbiting data pads, handing it to her with a sheepish smile. She accepted it, and for a moment, our hands brushed, accidental, fleeting, yet electrifying. I felt a jolt of awareness, a thrill that had nothing to do with floating devices or collapsing holograms. The room was still chaotic, still absurd, but in that tiny contact, I found clarity. She had become my priority, and perhaps, in some small way, I had become hers. The final minutes were a blur of stabilization. Charts aligned, drones returned to their docking stations, and cups settled on tables. The mission, against all odds, was a success. Yet the true victory was the connection we had forged amid absurdity. She tilted her head, eyes sparkling, and whispered a comment I barely caught, a teasing remark that made my heart skip a beat. I laughed, a mixture of exhaustion and elation, and realized that no briefing, no training, could have prepared me for this, nor would I have wanted it any other way. As I floated back toward the shuttle, I cast a final glance at her, and she gave a small, knowing smile. The mission report would speak of trade deals, data, and procedural success. I would remember the chaos, the floating devices, and the laughter that had transformed a professional obligation into something unexpectedly personal. And though no one could have predicted it, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: her bouncy, chaotic, and utterly charming presence had become, without question, my priority.